Witch of the Village, her untold story. I'll never forget the first time I saw her. It was late in the afternoon, and the air in our small village felt heavy, as if something unseen was watching. She was walking down the dusty path that led to the market, a basket of herbs balanced on her hip, her head held high, despite the whispers that followed her like shadows. Stay away from her. My mother had warned me countless times. She brings misfortune wherever she goes. Even as a child, I could feel the weight of those words. Yet, I couldn't look away. There was something about her, not menacing but deeply sorrowful, as if she carried the burden of every terrible rumor the village had ever told about her. Her name was Adaku, but no one dared to call her that. To them, she was just the witch. Adaku's story didn't begin with fear and whispers. My grandmother once told me that long before I was born, Adaku was the pride of the village. She was known for her beauty, her intelligence, and most of all, her gift with herbs. People from miles away would come seeking her remedies. Women who struggled to conceive, men with injuries no one else could heal, and children on the brink of death. She saved your uncle once, my grandmother told me one night as we sat by the fire. He was barely 5, burning with a fever so high we thought he wouldn't make it. Adaku stayed up all night, grinding herbs and whispering prayers. By morning, your uncle was sitting up, asking for food. But even gifts as extraordinary as hers couldn't protect her from what was to come. The chief's son fell ill during the peak of the dry season, when the air was so hot it felt like fire. He was barely 10 years old, a lively boy who everyone loved. When the fever came, it swept through him like a storm, leaving him pale and weak. The chief and his wife called every healer they could find, but nothing worked. Finally, in desperation, they summoned Adaku. "She's our last hope," the chief's wife said, her voice trembling. Adaku came without hesitation, despite knowing how dangerous it was for her. For 3 days, she stayed by the boy's side, grinding herbs, making potions, and placing cool cloths on his forehead. But on the morning of the 4th day, the boy passed away. Grief is a terrible thing. It can twist love into hatred, gratitude into blame. The chief's wife, broken by the loss of her only child, turned on Adaku. "You did this," she screamed, her voice raw with pain. "You killed my son." The accusation was like a mat thrown into dry grass. It ignited a fire that spread faster than anyone could stop. People who once sang Adaku's praises now spat at her feet. Every misfortune the village faced, failed crops, sick livestock, even the storms that tore roofs from houses, was suddenly her fault. Adaku didn't fight back. She retreated to the edge of the village, where she lived alone in a small, crumbling hut. Over time, the whispers turned into full-blown stories of her witchcraft. Parents warned their children to stay away. Some villagers even claimed to have seen her summoning spirits in the dead of night. I was a child when all this happened, too young to understand the full weight of it. But the fear of Adaku was etched into my mind, like a story told too many times to forget. It wasn't until years later, when I was a teenager, that I began to question everything. It started with a dare. "Go to her hut," my friends whispered one evening as we sat around a fire. "If you're brave, knock on her door." I didn't want to do it, but I also didn't want to look like a coward. So I went, my heart pounding with every step. The path to her hut was overgrown with weeds, and the closer I got, the more I felt like I was being watched. When I knocked, the door creaked open, revealing a sight I hadn't expected. Her home wasn't dark and cursed like the story said. It was warm and smelled of herbs and freshly baked bread. Adaku herself didn't look like a witch. She looked tired. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice softer than I expected. I wanted to see if the stories were true," I stammered. She sighed and stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. That's when everything I thought I knew began to unravel. I started visiting Adaku more often after that. At first it was out of curiosity, but soon it became something more. She taught me about plants and their healing properties, how to mix potions for fever and salves for burns. She told me stories of her youth, of how she once dreamed of leaving the village and traveling the world. She never spoke ill of the villagers who hated her. "They're just afraid," she said one evening, as she stirred a pot of soup. "Fear makes people do terrible things." The more I learned, the more I realized how wrong the village had been. The crops that failed, a result of poor rainfall. The sick livestock, a disease that spread from a neighboring village. And the chief's son, the more I learned, the more I realized how wrong the village had been. The crops that failed, a result of poor rainfall. The sick livestock, a disease that spread from a neighboring village. And the chief's son, a victim of an illness no one could have cured. But the truth didn't matter to the villagers. They needed someone to blame, and Adaku was an easy target. Then came the fire. One night, a group of young men, drunk and emboldened by their hatred, set fire to Adaku's hut. I watched from a distance, too afraid to intervene as the flames devoured her home. She stood outside, clutching a small bundle of belongings, her face illuminated by the blaze. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just watched. Her shoulders squared, as if she'd expected this all along. The next morning she was gone. No one knew where she went. Some said she moved to another village. Others claimed she disappeared into the forest, becoming the spirit they'd always feared. Years later, I left the village for university, but I never forgot Adaku. Her story stayed with me, a constant reminder of how easily fear and ignorance can destroy a life. Once, when I returned to the village, I asked my grandmother about her. She shook her head sadly. "People never understood her," she said. "They feared what they couldn't control, but she was never the monster they made her out to be. Sometimes I wonder what became of her. Did she find a place where she was accepted, where her gifts were valued instead of feared? What I do know is this: Adaku wasn't the villain of the story. She was its victim. And sometimes the real villains are the ones holding the torches."